Good day. Welcome to our third webinar in the series of the Global XTL Summit. Today we're going to talk about, the XTL, ESG compliance, LCF credits, and carbon, net zero, and other pathways. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to introduce Stefan Onosh, specialist from and MD of Life Cycle Associates. Stefan, very welcome. Thank you for your contribution today.
My pleasure to be here.
What we will do, I'm going to just give us a bit of background. There's a disclaimer. We provide a lot of information. We should actually show this and discuss this with our advisors. I would also like to highlight our overall XTL Summit strategy. There's our mission and vision. I want to just check here. It seems like our audio is on or off. I can see that. Good. Everyone can actually hear us. It seems like some people were finding out where to actually look at audio. That should be open and available. Let me get back to this. What is our objective? What is our mission? What is our vision? We want to make sure that we enable the XTL industry. We want to create a collaboration platform where everyone can come together, talk about how do we move XTL projects forward. We want to create an XTL voice where we communicate to the different players in the industry, whether you are a feedstock supplier, an off-taker, technology supplier, a developer, an owner, or a person that would like to contribute to the industry. We create a platform where everyone can communicate, learn from each other, so that we would make this industry successful. That means that we need to take ownership, of the opportunities, the challenges that we have. We need to have the courage and step into the leadership of what we want to do, how we want to do that, and how to make sure that we have a collaborative approach, working together and moving things forward. But it also means that we need to apply stewardship. How do we actually act as good stewards of what we receive, whether it's gas, bioresources, or any of the other resources that we have? How do we steward that well and create the clean, environmental friendly energy that is possible and available to us today? So this is important to us. Good. If we move forward, there's been a number of events, a number of webinars that we had so far. We had the first XTL 101, that gives the background. We also had last webinar about how do we actually look at the financing, the enablers and barriers. And today we're going to talk about the ESG compliance, LCF and carbon credits and the different pathways, but there's also a number of other events, coming up. And as they will materialize, we will make available information and invite, all of you to this. The contact detail, this is Stefan Onosh, and I need to put a disclaimer. I actually gave Stefan a doctorate that he said he doesn't have. So my apologies for that. We will rectify that, during the communication. My own contact, detail, and Stefan will have his cell phone and other information later. So, Stefan, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the depth of detail and information that you're going to convey to us. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you. Today I'm going to talk about the environmental impacts of XTL technologies. First, a little bit about what a low carbon XTL technology might be. What are some of the pathways? Then we'll talk about some of the regulatory drivers. Finally, look at the greenhouse gas emissions for an example and how that affects different things affect the greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, how that affects some of the incentive value for XTL fuels. So basically, you can define many things as an XTL technology. I always assume it's a combination of gasification or reforming or partial syngas preparation, followed by the production of a synthetic fuel like Fischer-Tropsch jet, diesel, or methanol or ethanol. And there's many ways to configure systems, but we're primarily going to talk about FT gasification systems. It's not just about the technology. You need the technology to make sure that you can produce fuels, but the feedstock and how you configure the technology affects your environmental footprint. And then the markets you sell it into depends on whether you'll make any money. So here is an example of several FT pathways. The classic one is biomass gasification, potentially with the supplement of natural gas to hydrogen, or perhaps electrolysis to hydrogen, followed by FT synthesis to produce transportation fuels. Of course, you can make jet, diesel, naphtha for gasoline. However, there's a lot of other interesting pathways. For example, you could go to methanol, and the methanol would be a feedstock for biodiesel. So if you have, if that's a technology you want to explore, that could work. There's many possibilities for ethanol, and there's also many end routes. So you don't necessarily have to make fuels. There are opportunities for biomaterials and many other options where there isn't necessarily the same incentive system that we have today, but still some opportunities. Some of the interesting options also include air capture as a carbon source, as well as biogas. So using biogas has a number of environmental consequences. Generally, what's happening is the carbon in the biogas is not emitted into the air. So if you're using landfill gas, you're avoiding the landfill gas from flaring. So that's effectively a carbon neutral feedstock. And if you're using biogas from anaerobic digestion of dairy manure, for example, you could be preventing the manure from being pumped into a lagoon and making methane emissions. So that would have a nice effect on your environmental footprint. And finally, there's this zigzag line from the biogas. Under many programs, you can transfer an environmental attribute so that you can use biogas as a feedstock, but you actually uptake natural gas from the pipeline and transport the environmental attribute. And of course, carbon capture is always an option when you have a syngas system that produces concentrated CO2. So that's kind of a range of XTL pathways. I'm sure there's more. So what are some of the factors that affect low emissions? The first thing you can do to have low emissions is to have your carbon removed from the atmosphere recently. So biomass, forest residue, energy crops are all short carbon cycle feedstocks. In general, you need to worry about whether the feedstock is really considered to be carbon neutral. So forest residue is a pretty safe bet. It counts as a biofuel under the RFS under the right circumstances, and it's generally acknowledged that forest residue would decompose to become CO2 eventually. CO2 from the air is another option, and then there's the avoided emissions. So flared landfill gas, digester gas, landfilling of the biogenic portion of MSW. Those all result in emissions that otherwise wouldn't occur. And you can also use low carbon renewable power. So many of the feedstock parameters have little to do with your technology, which I'm not here to talk about today. But of course, if you can make a technology with a high yield, that means you get more per ton of biomass, more impact for the power or material you have to put in. And if you can recover, as much steam or other energy from your process to minimize your power consumption, that leads to an attractive process also. So there's a number of programs that are available today and will be available in the future that help you monetize greenhouse gas reductions. So, and they have different metrics, and so we'll talk about some of them. The California Low Carbon Fuel Standard provides an incentive in proportion to the greenhouse gas reductions relative to a baseline. Whereas the federal RFS is a volume obligation. So you have thresholds for greenhouse gas reductions, and if you meet the threshold, then your technology can generate the Renewable Identification Number, or RIN as it's called. Under the European Renewable Energy Directive, there's a requirement for a certain volume of renewable fuels, and there are also threshold requirements. The ICAO, which is the International Organization for Aviation, has the CORSIA requirements, which pulls aviation fuels out of the national greenhouse gas reporting and allows airlines to buy aviation fuels with low greenhouse gas emissions. There's also programs in many other regions. The Brazilian Renova Bio program is structured very similar to the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. British Columbia has an LCFS, as does Oregon, and the Midwest states and Washington are considering them. And another thing I've heard many times over the past decade is carbon credits. Well, there are voluntary carbon credits, and those are for individuals and companies who would like to reduce their carbon footprint, but they're generally not mandated by regulation, so they have a much lower economic value. The next few slides will talk a little bit about the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So under the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the state of California has developed a greenhouse gas reduction requirement that applies to gasoline and diesel fuels. So the petroleum baseline fuel is about 100 grams per megajoule, and the program requires reductions over time. So if you have a fuel with a carbon intensity of say 80 grams per megajoule, you would have a 20% greenhouse gas reduction. So you have fuels with carbon intensities down here. However, this requirement here applies to all of the gasoline and diesel sold in aggregate. So the petroleum folks, they need to come up with a greenhouse gas reductions that are based on purchasing biofuels, electric power, and other measures of reducing greenhouse gas reductions. And this requirement declines every year. So there's a couple of interesting factors here. One is the requirement grows over time, which means that more credits are required every year. However, the difference between the CI of your fuel and the standard also declines over time. So you have a number of dynamic factors, and you'd be well advised to understand all of that in your business planning. The Low Carbon Fuel Standard has a market-based price, which is dependent upon what they call the obligation, which is the difference between the standard and the petroleum baseline that's generated by all of the fuel producers. So every year the obligation rises. It's also based on sentiment regarding the program. Folks must have thought that the LCFS program was not going to succeed back in 2014. And then the ARB had a readoption hearing, and they reapproved the LCFS, and then there have subsequently been more board actions by the Air Resources Board. And then some of the price movement has to do with just supply and demand, reporting obligations. But generally, the credit price has moved from below $50 a ton to what's hovering around $200 a ton, even in periods of low fuel demand inspired by COVID. The LCFS provides an opportunity for a number of fuels, including electric power, hydrogen, aviation fuels, and diesel. So this gives you an idea of the Air Resources Board's projections for the low carbon fuels in the program. Basically, 10% of the ethanol and gasoline, 10% of gasoline is ethanol, and most of that has come from corn-based ethanol with some contribution from sugarcane ethanol, and that the contribution to ethanol will basically remain in proportion to how much gasoline is sold. Then we also have biodiesel, which is about 4% of gasoline, and renewable diesel, which you can blend up to 100% of gasoline. Now, XTL, so there's about 37,000 barrels a day of renewable diesel capacity in California today. And if you look at some of the XTL projects, they could, easily be on that order of magnitude. Aviation fuels today are primarily also based on renewable diesel, and biomethane has primarily been going to compressed natural gas or CNG vehicles. And almost all of the biomethane is generated through a book and claim mechanism, which means that a landfill injects the biogas anywhere in the United States and keeps track of that renewable attribute. And then the CNG or LNG station records the transfer of that attribute, and then the low greenhouse gas emissions are applied to the CNG. The same works for dairy biogas, which has a lower carbon intensity. So to date, almost all of the biomethane has gone to these CNG vehicles. However, under the LCFS, you can also use biomethane by book and claim for the production of any fuel, such as biogas to jet, or even a co-feed to gasification to Fischer-Tropsch fuels. So, as well as renewable diesel. So we see more opportunities for biomethane, which is important because the opportunities for CNG are not growing as quickly as the biomethane sources are growing. So that's an important option. And another slide I could show you is credit generators. There's other credit generators such as carbon capture and sequestration, and various other projects such as reducing emissions from oil refineries. So this all contributes to the LCFS compliance. Another program is CORSIA, which requires achieving a greenhouse gas threshold, and a variety of wastes and residues are eligible as feedstocks, and forest residue is along that list. And many of the aviation partners who are looking at complying with CORSIA are also certifying their fuels under the Roundtable for Sustainable Biomaterials, which provides additional verification of many ESG practices, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also compliance with labor laws as well as corporate governance. So let's talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are measured on a life cycle basis for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is an electric car would have zero greenhouse gas emissions if you only counted the direct emissions, so would a hydrogen car. So it's pretty clear for transportation, you need to count your well-to-wheel or well-to-wake emissions. And similarly, crops, they remove CO2 from the atmosphere, they emit it from the vehicle, so those are basically balanced. So these all of the nuances for the greenhouse gas emissions are taken into account with several greenhouse gas accounting systems. So the ISO 14040, which has been around since 2006, has procedures for how to do a life cycle analysis. Hey, Nico, are we still on camera? I don't see you moving.
I am very still and listening intently to you, Stefan, and I thinking about all the things like your life cycle assessments, and it might be worthwhile for you to just give a few comments on, if it's all diesel, there's a different way. But if you've got other chemicals and like base oils and other products that you make, there's some nuances of how you do your well-to-wheels and your grid model different. Maybe elaborate on that as well.
I'll talk about that. So there's a number there's a number of different ways to analyze your greenhouse gas emissions. All of them basically are looking at well-to-wheels. Some calculation schemes would have you looking at materials of production or even the vehicle. However, the vehicle is a very small fraction of the total life cycle. And if you look at, for example, a passenger car, when you're in an airplane, the pilot tells you how many pounds of fuel is on board the plane. When you're in the car, you don't really realize, but you're burning 500 gallons times 6 pounds of gallon per gallon. You're burning 3,000 pounds of fuel a year. So you can see that the fuel really is the big source of greenhouse gas emissions for the car. So there's other options for selling fuel. So if you sell just base oils, you might potentially have a customer who cares about the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. However, it gets complicated when you're looking at both the production of fuels and co-products. So here is sort of a typical Fischer-Tropsch fuel pathway where you're bringing in a feedstock to a fuel production facility. And what you're also doing is you're producing multiple co-products. So you're producing, in this case, jet. You're also producing diesel. You're producing naphtha. You might be producing some base oils. And the emissions need to be allocated between the products and the co-products. 10 years ago, all sorts of interesting math was put forward as an option. But basically, the options that are used under the Low Carbon Fuel Standard or the Renewable Energy Directive or other programs are pretty well defined. So if you're making only making diesel, naphtha, and jet, then the general idea is that you would allocate your emissions based on the energy content. So the greenhouse gas emissions per megajoule of diesel, naphtha, and jet are going to be the same because they're all part of the same denominator. Now, what do you do about base oils, which are produced not for their energy value? Or what if you were to produce some kind of ethylene that went into polypropylene, pellets, at the FT facility? It wouldn't be logical to allocate those emissions based on the energy content. So depending on how you conduct an LCA, you might allocate the emissions based on economic value. But basically, all of the emissions coming in are associated with natural gas, electric power, hydrogen. These are all your inputs to a process as well as the biomass, and they all have upstream emissions. So you have so for example, if you have an energy crop, you would have nitrogen fertilizer, and you'd also have other farming inputs. But the biggest source of emissions for an energy crop would be N2O associated with the application of fertilizers. Now, in the case of forest residues, you're really not applying any fertilizer, so the primary emission source really is associated with hauling the emissions. And one principle that's often forgotten is a life cycle analysis is supposed to take into account the system that you're looking at relative to a reference system. So when it gets down to trying to understand how to deal with your feedstock, understanding the alternative fate is important. I'll talk a little bit about some other feedstocks. So in the case of forest residue, it's generally recognized that the alternative fate would be that the forest residue decomposes. There's other points of view. For example, if you're diverting forest residue from bark beetle damage, you may be avoiding a wildfire risk. How to monetize that under the LCFS is yet to be determined. If you're bringing in MSW, for example, you're preventing material from going into a landfill, which produces methane emissions. That's taken into account under the LCFS. So there's lots of nuances on your alternative fate. And of course, if you're taking CO2 out of the air, you get a credit for that. If you're pumping it underground, you get a credit for that. Although under the low carbon fuel standard, that requires careful monitoring as well as assurance over a 100-year period that the CO2 would not be emitted. So this next chart here shows an example that's somewhat consistent with the GREET model for a biomass to FT diesel pathway compared to petroleum diesel. So petroleum diesel has a carbon intensity of about 100 grams per megajoule, of which 72 is the carbon in the fuel when it's burned, plus methane and N2O from the vehicle. And then there's also the oil refining right here, and then the crude oil production, and then the refining. And so those contribute to the total life cycle of petroleum. In the case of FT diesel, the feedstock actually has a relatively low carbon footprint for forest residue, because you need to simply need to collect the material, ship it, and haul it to your facility. And then in the fuel production process, there's a number of ways to end up with greenhouse gas emissions. One is tail gas that's burned results in methane and N2O emissions. Another source of emissions is almost everyone finds that having some process heat from natural gas is helpful, or having supplemental hydrogen helps improve your yield. And then finally, electric power for all of the compression can add up, and the carbon footprint of the power depends on the region where you're located. Now, the greenhouse gas emissions for the power depend on the eGrid region under the low carbon fuel standard, and that's part of the LCFS regulation. So if you're in California, the greenhouse gas emissions are about 300 grams per kilowatt hour, but they can be as high as 600 grams per kilowatt hour in other regions. And under the LCFS regulation, you cannot buy renewable energy credits for process energy. So if you have natural gas as a heater fuel, you can't buy renewable energy credits. Similarly for the electric power. However, if the electric power is used to make hydrogen, which is going into your fuel, you could buy the credits through book and claim. And similarly, that's also an option for renewable natural gas that's going into a process. These next two charts show some options for carbon capture and sequestration. This is capturing a fairly substantial portion of the capture-ready CO2, and this particular process would then require a little bit more electric power, and some or all of the CO2 could be captured. And another option is to use biogas. So the biogas might carry with it a carbon intensity of negative 200 grams per, or even negative 300 grams per megajoule. So depending on how much biogas you use as a feedstock, or whether you use it on site, if you can figure that out, that could even result in a negative carbon intensity. But it all depends on your energy inputs and yields. This is relatively straightforward to calculate if you spent 5,000 hours using the GREET model. So the next part of this that's interesting is what does this mean in terms of potential credit revenue? So here's an example of a fuel pathway that gets a carbon intensity of 5 grams per megajoule, doing some carbon capture and sequestration. You probably would do more carbon capture and sequestration, but I didn't. I just wanted to use this as an illustrative example. So you have about $1.60 of fuel revenue, maybe less today, and you have the value of the D3 RIN. Of course, you need to make sure that the feedstock is RFS compliant. Forest residue on non-federal lands are the most straightforward, but many other feedstocks are possible for the LCFS. If you have co-products like diesel and jet, those are also eligible for generating RINs. The LCFS credit is based on the basically the difference between the LCFS target, which now is about 90 grams per megajoule, and the CI for your fuel. So I said we were doing a 5 gram per megajoule example. So you're getting credits based on this difference times the gallons of fuel you're producing and the grams per megajoule of fuel. That gets you the LCFS credits. You might be eligible for a biodiesel tax credit, and if you're doing CCS, you also could be subject to Section 45Q credits, which would all add up to the potential credit revenue. And in order to monetize the revenue under the LCFS, you sell the fuel, and either your customer will record those credits as soon as they purchase the fuel, or there's many other participants in the value chain who will cause that to happen. Same for the RINs, and there you go. You have a fairly attractive incentive to work with. Now, one question might be, how long are these incentives going to be around? So there's a couple of factors to consider. One is, under the RFS, the value of the RIN is set by the market price, and there's also what's called a cellulosic waiver credit. So, for example, if the market price of D3 RINs were something like $4 per gallon, and the price of crude oil was $20 a barrel, the cellulosic waiver credit would give you an upper bound for the value of the RIN. So you could purchase a conventional D6 and D5 RIN, and then you purchase the cellulosic waiver credit, and then you'll have comfort in knowing that you never have to spend more than roughly $3.50 a RIN. However, that provides a ceiling on your RIN price. So if the price of crude oil were to go to, let's say $150 a barrel, then the cellulosic waiver credit would decline in value. However, the biggest factor today is the administration's determination of the renewable volume obligation, combined with the small refinery exemptions. So those factors result in kind of a balance of supply and demand between the between the what the obligated parties need to purchase and what the fuel producers can produce. So effectively, the administration is setting the price. Now, under the LCFS, the price is based on the supply and demand for LCFS credits, and those are based on the compliance curve. So it's a little bit more detached. The demand for credits, the obligation, depends on how many gallons of fuel are sold every year and how many credits are generated. So, where is the knob on this? Clearly, with a reduction in demand, that's reducing the obligation, and perhaps cars could become more efficient, or maybe Californians might even lose an interest in driving. I'm certainly losing an interest in driving, certainly in other fuel use activities. So those factors affect the demand. On the supply side, all of these different fuel producers can contribute to the LCFS. There's electric cars. There's definitely more renewable diesel projects coming online. There's 6 or more FT projects. Red Rock, Northwest Advanced Biofuels, Fulcrum, USA Bioenergy, DG Energy, Velocis. They're all potential providers. So once you have more supply, that could actually affect the credit price, or the ARB could approve other mechanisms for generating credits. Recently, they've approved what's called fuel infrastructure credits for hydrogen and for electric vehicle charging. So they're allowing fuel station operators to generate credits as their capacity is underutilized. So there are some wild cards in the LCFS going out into the future. However, the program is very popular with the board members, and as long as the board continues to support the LCFS, they might even in the future vote for continued greenhouse gas reductions beyond 2030. So there's that. Now, the tax credit apparently is based on the whims of Congress, and recently has always been approved in arrears. We know how much fun that is. And then I think the 45Q program is relatively stable in its position. So finally, I'd like to summarize with what's your pathway to obtaining environmental value? It's great that you have a technology that can make fuel that's reliable, that you can get financed. However, that's just one piece of the environmental value. The credit depends on whether you have a regulatory program that's in place and that's stable over time, and that you can meet all of the requirements of the regulatory program, including verification. For example, if you're using biogas from a dairy, you have to prove that. You have to prove the entire supply chain, and you have to basically become vertically integrated. So the feedstock, such as MSW or forest residue, determines the avoided emissions. And then finally, it's the regulatory program that helps you sell the fuel, because it provides an additional incentive for the that takes into account the environmental attributes. So with that, thank you for your attention, and look forward to some questions.
Stefan, thank you very much. I think there's a lot of technical discussion, a lot of know-how in this. If I step back, and I ask myself, as owner, developer, and someone looking into this industry, it seems like there's a global drive for cleaner fuels. So we see some of the major organizations making statements that they want to be net zero, at a certain, stage in the future. We see a push, towards cleaner, environmental friendly, better fuels. Do you see that as an environment that is conducive to support, whether it's an LCFS, whether it's RINs and other, to continue to stay in operation and be supported?
Sort of yes and no. when organizations say they want to go to net zero, they rarely describe the rule book that goes with that. So, and recently, the neighborhood city said they're going to go to net zero. I don't think they know what that means. Are you allowed to count, credits for diverting emissions from landfills? If you sell the credits, does that mean you can't count that as part of your accounting? The whole accounting system, needs to be understood if you can make net zero claims. Now, the aviation community has a program under CORSIA where they will have well-defined rules. So they will count they have a mechanism for counting the greenhouse gas emissions, and the rules are well-defined.
Yeah.
And it's well known, for example, that the aviation industry cannot afford to pay the kinds of premiums that we're looking at here. They can't afford to pay, $6 a gallon for fuel when on-road fuel is selling for $2 a gallon. So what has to happen is that the aviation community needs to partner with fuel developers in order to make sure that these environmental attributes are, passed on to the fuel producer, and then they're able to find an opportunity to get to these low emission fuels. So it's a tricky, it's not like any of these commercial companies have an open pocketbook. If you want to make biomass to plastic, and there's no, there's no regulation of low carbon plastic standard, it's gonna be very difficult to see, your next, million pounds of steak wrapped in, low carbon plastic. So that's kind of the outlook. But with fuel programs, there's well-defined mechanisms, and as those mechanisms expand to other parts of the world, there'll be an opportunity to expand the revenue sources.
But I think what I'm seeing is, and specifically maybe on the fuel side, that it's more mature, there's more structure, it is leaning towards bigger programs, and the current programs will be in maybe another shape, but it will continue to be there as the global drivers for cleaner fuels. That's the tendency that we see.
And I think aviation is going to come together because the CORSIA requirements are going to apply globally. So,
yeah.
If a fuel producer, takes off in, in Kenya and flies to the U.S., they're going to want to eventually meet their CORSIA obligations, and, having locally produced fuels are going to have value. Maybe it'll be monetized first as part of a U.S. policy, but it remains to be, for trips to the U.S. So all of this remains to be seen how it sorts itself out over time.
Yeah, 100%. We've got a few questions, and Giant, has asked the question: what is the possibility for cellulosic ethanol into California versus the RNG with almost 95% plus D3 RINs being captured by RNG? Can you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, I've worked on a number of cellulosic ethanol projects, and the reason they're not selling fuel today, one was no one knew that the LCFS prices would go to $200 a ton. They might have had more resources, 8 years ago if they knew that was the case. And the technologies are difficult to implement. You need to worry about sterile conditions. You need to worry about enzyme sources. You need to worry about recovering lignin. So there's a number of fuel developers that are still at it, and it looks like they'll eventually succeed. And what's happened is that the RNG producers have basically found a very nice incentive, and that's potentially putting the incentive in jeopardy, because if you as a customer or as an oil company, sees someone getting paid, $70 a million BTU, based on a program that was, well, let's talk about the $15 to $30 a million BTU for the RIN. If you see, customers across the country that are effectively paying for that, with the notion that wastes would go to liquid fuels, and now you see it going a different way, that might be, part of the motivation for the administration to go easy on the RVO. But I think cellulosic ethanol will eventually succeed. It's challenging because you look at a feedstock, it costs say $60 a ton to bring a feedstock to a facility, and if your yield is $60, 60 gallons per ton, that's $1 per gallon. And you look at corn at $3 a bushel, and three gallons per bushel, that's also $1 per gallon, but you're making distillers grains as a co-product. So it's going to be financially challenging, to pull off cellulosic ethanol.
Good. Robert asked the question, can you comment on the situation where SAF is sent to California for LCFS credits, but also gets credits under CORSIA? Can you count all credits for both?
That's a good question. I think the answer is yes. I think that's an important, certainly RFS and LCFS are different. They're different obligations. That's what the lawyers said. The short answer is that the agency said you could. The logic is nice, right? So the RFS is a volume obligation. The LCFS is a greenhouse gas reduction requirement. But it will remain interesting, whether CORSIA and LCFS can be counted, but I don't see how it couldn't, because the LCFS is such a big driver for these fuels. I think you will be able to count them.
Good. Stefan, I always look at risk in the way we develop, and if you look at your, one of your previous graphs where you indicate, the level of revenue that we get from, the different credits and RINs and tax incentive programs, that is, if it's not 70%, it is a large portion of your revenue profile. And then as a financier, the last webinar that we had, Paul Brown talked about, the insurance programs available to insure that. What is, in your view, the risk, for owners and developers in looking at that last revenue side, that it would stay there and be available in something that you can count on? Because normally your projects are taking, at least, 5 and longer years to repay themselves. Have you got certainty on that revenue, at least for that period of time? What is your view on this?
Well, there's two ways to finance these projects. What you see most is what you call the project finance folks, who they go and get an offtake agreement on the sale of fuels, and they go get an insurance product because the bankers insist that the revenue be guaranteed in order to provide the loan. The other approach is the balance sheet project, where an oil company just builds the project based on their balance sheet. Look who's obligated under these programs. The oil companies are obligated under the LCFS. They're obligated under the RFS. They could save a lot of money if they would simply invest in these projects. At the same time, perhaps they're not hoping that these programs will be around forever. Maybe I think the end game might very well be that the oil industry invests in more of the projects. But if it's done on the project finance basis, you need someone who's willing to take the gamble that the LCFS will be around. And you can hire me as much as you want to make supply curves and look at the outlook for the LCFS, but at the end of the day, there's 1 or 12 individuals who will determine the fate of the LCFS, and that's not proof that the program will be around. Also, you can taper your this revenue over time. Maybe I'll put 100% in my business plan in year 1 and taper it down over time, but you can't prove to an investor that the programs will be there at year 10 or year 5. So you need to find someone to take the other part of the risk.
No, that is true. I know you give a very scientific and almost legalistic view that there is no proof of everything, but indicatively, and if I look at the trend, the LCFS California has got a target of 90, sitting there, but they've already indicated up to 2030, they're dropping down to 80. So that would mean that there is, at least for the next 10 years, some intent to actually keep the program around and make sure that the credits and other, structures are available, for the development.
Well, an important message to take away here is the technologies that get there first. They're able to get full value for the incentive as the incentive eventually either is competed away or goes away. So in the case of biomass power in California, there was a 10-cent per kilowatt hour tariff. The first power plants were able to take advantage of it. Of course, they can't operate now without such requirements. The first biogas projects were able to take advantage of $30 RINs per million BTU, and some dairy projects are getting $60 a million BTU. Something's going to happen 5 years down the road where that number isn't going to be $60. For example, there could be a regulation in California that requires lagoons to be covered. So the ARB would not provide an incentive for something that's covered by regulation, but they also most likely would provide some form of tapering out. So as investors early on in the program are not punished for having made that investment.
Yeah. I think overall, there's a number of moving parts as you indicated before. I want to, Loreen ask the question: is the calculation credit a market-based stock exchange or a cool pot options?
The credits are based on a party-to-party basis with published credit transaction prices. I've helped broker a few tiny credit deals, and I call up one party and I say, hey, my guy has some credits you want to buy. They look at the recent market price and they agree upon the credit. They determine the day the trade will happen, and then they either before or after transfer the money. Now there's also what's called the credit clearance market, where you can sign up to sell your credits. But this is not viewed as an attractive way to sell the credits, because the obligated parties would go to the credit clearance market only if they've failed to find credits through another mechanism. So basically, the way it was explained to me is that's not really an attractive mechanism. So there's not a stock exchange. And the other challenge in selling the credits is one of volume. So most trades in the $1 million range are what's expected. So if you offer someone a $50,000 credit transaction, they have a lot of problems. It's not just that they want to make $1 million, but their legal department has to be involved. They have to check out your credit risk. There's lots of situations where folks won't say, we don't want to do a small deal. However, most of these FT projects are in the 3,000 barrel a day range, so they won't have any problem. If they have either they have to find an off-taker initially, but even if they have, for example, let's say they make renewable naphtha and they don't have an off-taker, they will generate the credits and be able to find a customer.
I think, part of my takeaway in a lot of, previous projects and things been involved with this, Stefan, is that, make sure that you understand the different requirements, for the different credit programs to qualify and keep qualified. Secondly, that, you make sure when you actually, qualify to actually attract the RINs or the credits, at what stage in the life cycle of your production, that you can actually, accrue that when you actually sell the actual products. And then, make sure that you've got the right credit worthy partners in the end that would either, partner with you in the selling of the different credits. And, there are a variety of commercial deals available to either broker or, set up and say, I would accept this and we share the profit of the credits, on a, pro rata basis, whatever you agree in the end. But there's a number of alternatives, and nuances that, should be looked into to, have a look at. Can I maybe, we've got, a few minutes left, and then maybe, when is the best time to get people involved to help you understand, in the life cycle of the project? Is that starting at your pre-feed stage, during feed? When is a good time to get specialists like yourself involved? And, what is the typical thing that you need? Just for a few minutes.
It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to understand the implications of your feedstock and make sure that you fully understand them. So even a small effort to study your feedstock is worthwhile. For example, looking at an energy crop might involve indirect land use conversion. Looking at MSW, you would need to look at the characterization of your feedstock in order to make an estimate of what your avoided greenhouse gas emissions are. A lot of I wish I had $1 for every time someone wanted to use renewable energy credits. I would be a rich person. So a lot of fuel producers have ideas, but they're not founded in the regulation. So they're just ideas, and you really need to compare your ideas, and then ideally you'll optimize your process based on what you expect the regulation to be. So there's a lot of options with co-feeding of natural gas, dealing with renewable attributes, dealing with renewable power. You want to make sure that you've got those right, because you could potentially be producing 10, 20, 30% more fuel, depending on how you configure your system.
Good. Well, Stefan, I think, we've, got a few minutes. Thank you very much for your insightful input and where we are today. I want to thank you, just for the input. I want to, direct everyone that is, as part of the discussion today, go to the XTL, Global XTL Summit LinkedIn page. There you will find, the upcoming, events coming up, that is going to look, we're going to talk about the technology landscape and delve into what technologies are available with Pauli Baumann from Hatch to talk about the types of technologies, where it would fit in, benefits, pros and cons of the different technologies. But we're also going to look at some of the other areas that it's going to follow up, the marketing of the RINs. Thank you very much. We really appreciate for all the people attending. Thank you for making the time available. We value as partners in developing this industry. We think it is the right way forward. We know that there's a lot of complexities that we need to deal with, but that's why we work together, and that's why we actually look at developing this on a platform and with the right partnerships involved. So, Stefan, thank you very much. Looking forward to a lot of interaction and people, asking the right type of questions.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good. We'll see each other again.